So, good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. And welcome to this talk I'm going to give on archaeology and Lidar, and specifically with my title, iPads, Volunteers and Lidar, Discovering the Historic Landscape of Martinshaw Wood, Groby, Leicestershire. I am Matt Beamish, and I've been working as an archaeologist in Leicestershire since 1990, and with the University of Leicester Archaeological Services since 1995. ULAS is an archaeological unit embedded within the School of Archaeology and Ancient History at the University of Leicester. My specialisms have included prehistoric settlement and waterlogged wood, and I spend more time these days doing technical stuff. I've been developing relational databases and using GIS for archaeological recording and analysis. And I'm currently managing a number of archaeological projects for ULAS in the East and West Midlands and running database systems for ULAS. I've been working with aerial LiDAR as part of archaeological work driven by development and planning since the early 2000s. So I've got a long experience of using the data. I don't use it that often these days, but every now and again I do, and it's good to keep my hand in. The Environment Agency in England has been making aerial LiDAR available to third parties since the early 2000s. And in 2014-15, there was a big change in that we had to stop paying for it. The complete archive of aerial LiDAR was made freely available for reuse within certain licensing conditions as part of the Open Data Programme. The Environment Agency continued to expand the volume and coverage of 1 metre resolution data available with the objective of actually achieving full national coverage. I don't quite know where they are with that, but I know that the amount of data available is expanding. So what is LiDAR? Well, no doubt some of you will know, but for those of you who don't, LiDAR is an acronym for light detection and ranging. It's a remote sensing technology that measures distance by illuminating a target with a laser and analysing the reflected light. LiDAR, there's a bit of argument about this amongst the nerds, but anyway, I'm going to say to you, LiDAR was developed in the 1960s and used in the space programme. And for our purposes, it can be understood in two forms: terrestrial LiDAR and aerial LiDAR. Terrestrial LiDAR is used to record a landscape or perhaps a building with a scanner based on the ground. And aerial LiDAR is used to record large transects of landscape and is generally recorded by aircraft, although no doubt there's been moves to actually use unmanned aircraft now, drones and such like. So here's a picture of a light aircraft with a LiDAR scanner firing a laser pulse at the ground. Those pulses get to the ground and then come back to it, and it records the time taken. And all the time the aircraft's position and the position of the scanner is located with satellites, so we know exactly where it is. Now, when the laser is fired at the ground, you get what are called pulses of return. And in areas of woodland or where you've got vegetation, some pulses, the first pulses, will hit the canopy and then return back to the sender, the laser illuminator, and some more bits of laser will actually penetrate through further, and you get second and third returns, and some of them will actually get through to the ground. So, and this is really important, and what gives LiDAR such an amazing ability for us when we're trying to find things in woods. This is a map I put together in a GIS a couple of years ago now, showing the availability of open data LiDAR. Now, you can see the web link at the bottom of the page there. You're not going to be able to have time to copy it down, but these links are available and it's publicly accessible. So here we go. There's 2 metre resolution LiDAR, and there's 1 metre resolution LiDAR, ½ metre, and in some places even 25 centimetre resolution LiDAR. So the amount of LiDAR is definitely increasing. I dare say the 1 meter LiDAR has got a better coverage now than my map shows. And if we look in the Leicestershire area, so here for those of you from not from this region, and also from overseas, we're looking at Leicestershire in the East Midlands, Leicestershire, the county here, with Leicester in the centre, and that is where our data is. So a lot of 1 meter data, not very much higher resolution than that. Sorry, you couldn't see my mouse then. This is, here we go, here's Leicestershire. And Northamptonshire, Rutland, Nottinghamshire up here, Derbyshire, Warwickshire and Staffordshire. So how do we use the LiDAR? Well, the analysis workflow that I use is to create digital elevation models. These are acronymed as DEMs, and process the DEMs, the digital elevation models, with a variety of techniques to reveal the topography. And these techniques will include hill shading, slope analysis and aspect. A digital elevation model colours the data according to its height. Now this can be helpful, but as you'll see, sometimes it's not, and you need other techniques to actually show subtle changes in the topography that the simple DEM, the digital elevation model, doesn't show. And then we take our different plots and our different images and shades and things, and we compare those with known other pieces of information. So most basically Ordnance Survey mapping from the late 19th century and through the 20th century, to see if we can marry together features that we're seeing in the LiDAR with features that have already been mapped. And it's really, we're trying to find things that haven't been mapped, because that will actually give us a chance of finding things that have been unknown and undiscovered. And then we record our interpretation as data sets, as what we'd call vectors. So pieces of geometry, lines and polygons and points that have got coordinates and are fixed in space. So we record those and we'll give them names and interpretations so that we've got a data set to then work with and go and question. And then we need to really visit these sites to actually find out what had made a LiDAR signal, why we had thought there was something there. We need to go and see it on the ground to actually verify what it was. So with the analysis of LiDAR data, it's possible to objectively identify earthwork surviving as positive, so i.e. banks and lumps, and negative, i.e. ditches and holes and pits and things, across wide areas. Filtered LiDAR data enables the identification of earthworks through deciduous woodland. Now this comes back to me showing you the pulses and the returns, that some pulses actually get through to the bare earth, and if you get enough of those, you can actually start to make sense even where there are trees. So features that we might find might be boundary banks, ditches, fields and field systems, enclosures, pens, moats, platforms, roads, paths, holloways, droveways, anything that's actually left what's called surface expression, that's got something that's actually changed the surface of the land and left a pattern. That's what we're after. Park pales, wood banks, rabbit warrens, or pillow mounds as they're sometimes called. And then mounds, barrows, ring ditches, so round barrows, funerary monuments. The LiDAR has the potential to reveal features within areas of woodland that would otherwise be extremely difficult to identify and record. Now this is an image from Historic England, English Heritage LiDAR work in the Savernake Forest. And that's showing you the first pulse on a tree canopy. So a plane's flown over, firing its laser at the ground, and those first pulses have come back. And you can see the trees, can't you? You can see the tops of the trees. Well, this is what happens when you take those trees away and you only have the last returns, the bare earth. So there we can see some ditches in a formation. And there we go. There's some enclosure, possibly an ironate enclosure, possibly multi-phase, that's there, that's been revealed by looking at the filtered data in an area of dense woodland. So that's all brilliant, but the flip side of the objectivity and the ability to find these things is that LiDAR is generally non-discriminatory. So a modern bank can't necessarily be distinguished from an old bank. A medieval holloway might appear similar to a modern path or a modern sunken feature. A fallen tree, it gets worse, a fallen tree or an overgrown fence may give a similar signal to a length of bank. So here we go. This is actually in a bit of the outwards in Charnwood. And you can see there a fallen tree covered in bracken. And that does actually give a signal in the LiDAR to show a short linear feature there. And a woodland path may appear as an infilled ditch. And this is also in the outwards near Nampanton. There you can do just a very, very slight depression in the ground surface can actually lead to a LiDAR signal that you can plot. And then to actually discover what it is, you need to go and visit it and go, no, that's just a woodland path. Nothing more interesting than that. So we also have to be careful when we're using our techniques. And again, this is an old image of how hill shading, which is a brilliant technique, you need to use it from multiple directions. Now, basically with hill shading, we're taking our LiDAR data, which is heights on the ground, and then we are modeling it by casting shadows with the sun in particular directions. So here is an image of ridge and furrow, which is a particular form of English cultivation, English field system that starts in the early medieval period and carries right through in some places into the almost to the 19th century. So it's a long-lived form of strip cultivation. Generally, the strips get narrower in time. And the earlier ones have a really nice, lovely sinuous shape that's come from the turning of first the oxen and then the horses when they switched to horse traction. So you get a lovely S shape with this sinuous ridge and furrow. Here's a bit of ridge and furrow. It's not that nice, but it serves the purpose to illustrate how with the sun basically in an east-west direction, you can see the north-south ridge and furrow. And then if you switch the sun to a north-south direction, voila, you get actually slightly nicer east-west ridge and furrow, but the north-south ridge and furrow has gone. But it's the same data. It's just the sun's being modelled in different directions, and so you're getting different patterns. I haven't seen before. We've actually got slight heads here on this ridge and furrow. So here's this bit of curve. So basically the plough team is coming along and then they're getting near the end of what you call the furlong. The plough is lifted and then the team is turning and then coming back the other side again. So you get a slight enlargement where the plough's lifted. I think that's what's happening there. Okay, so yeah, basically you need to hill shade in different directions if you're going to do it, or you'll only see some parts of the evidence. So in addition to recording changes of ground height that might indicate the presence of a historic feature, LiDAR data also allows that feature to be set within the local topography because it lets you look at the landscape. So the location of a past settlement can be viewed in relation to slopes and its probable field systems. The location of ancient watercourses can be more easily located, even if current mapping hasn't picked them up, because you get the forms, you get the landforms, you get the slight stream valleys. The location of a feature such as a windmill can be viewed and understood within a wider environment. And for an area of ancient woodland, the topographic context can be more readily appreciated. So here we go, here's another map of Leicester and Leicestershire for you. We're actually going to have a quick here's where Martinshaw Wood is, to the west of Leicester. I'm actually going to give you a quick example of LiDAR used commercially, and that's from a site at Market Harbour to kind of explain some of those last things that I just mentioned. So here we go, Market Harbour, Market Town on the Leicestershire Northamptonshire border, and we can see here in red, here in red is an area that's potentially out for development. And so we looked at the LiDAR data as part of that proposal. Now, here is the development area, and it's been laid over the 19th century Ordnance Survey mapping from 1880. So that's really just showing us parts of 2 fields. We're not seeing any more on the late 19th century mapping than that. Now, if you look at the 2-inch Ordnance Survey mapping, and the 2-inch to 1 mile maps were dated from the early 19th century, and they were put together across England as the Ordnance Survey was starting to get its mapping act in gear. And the 2-inch Ordnance Survey map clearly shows in our location Harbour Mill. Now, these 2-inch maps are all available from the British Library in digital format, and we're going to post some links to those online so that you can actually go and have a browse. They are a little bit difficult to find because each map simply has a name, and it might not actually be the name that you're expecting. But so you have to cycle through the names and know what you want. There is an index map that you can look at, and that shows you all the names of the maps. So if you've got that, you can then find your map in alphabetical order. So some of you might find that useful. Okay, so Harbour Mill, we've got a mill definitely showing on the early 19th century map, but it's gone by the 1880s. So here's our same area. Here's our red area, which is the development area. And this here, the LiDAR is the green and the brown, and this is our digital elevation model. So basically brown is high. Down here in the corner, we've got a legend that's showing you the dark brown, top of that is 130 meters. And then the dark green is 93 meters, with the yellow, a kind of band in the middle. So that's telling us that we've got a hill and low and lower ground, a valley, a little river valley there. So that's how the DEM quite nicely shows you broad topographic information. But if you shade your data, it all gets much more interesting. So here is part of the LiDAR data. Here is our development area, and you can see we've got lots and lots of stuff showing. So we've got lots of ridge and furrow. You can see at the end here, you might be able to see the heads actually from where the plough's been lifted. You've got a slight enlargement of the ridge. And then it looks like on this side, they've been truncated, they've been chopped away by development. But most interestingly, we've got something curious in this area here that actually superimposes over, it looks to overlie the ridge and furrow. I'm just checking, can you actually see my mouse pointer? Yeah, you're getting some nods, good. Okay. So we can also, with LiDAR, so here we've got a mixture of shades, and we can also draw profiles along and across the data. So here we've got a more detailed view of that same LiDAR data, except we've got some slightly coloured hill shading showing, that's showing the ridge and furrow, and is showing a linear feature running across the site here with what looks like a mound in this area here, crossed by A and B. So those are the profiles that we can generate from the data. So here's profile A running from north to south. So here we've got a bit of ridge and furrow on top, which is what it should be. And then it comes down, and then we've actually got a slightly raised area on a flattened area, and then it falls away. Okay. And then profile B, which goes across this feature here, that shows a fairly credible mound. And then profile C, showing you the topography here. Actually, it's running down slope, and then where this feature is, there's actually a little bit of a terrace there. So, and there's a more enhanced hill shade using actually something called Sky View, where we've really tried to get the features come out. And I think that quite clearly shows that we've got a windmill mound there that post-dates the ridge and furrow, possibly with a service, a track to service it to bring grain and take away flour running over the field system in this bit of the site. So that all worked very nicely. That's a kind of picture looking up towards the mound. There's another photo of the kind of landscape, which will give you an idea of what the ground looks like. You can kind of see a bit of a mound there, I think. That all works quite well. And there is the broader view of the topography. And what I can show that modelled from the LiDAR across a wider area there of actually showing you this ridge and perhaps escarpment on the north side of Market Harbour. So here's our development area, here is our mill, here's the road through a cutting now running south, and you've got all these lovely field systems on the north side. So it kind of gives us a nice way to actually illustrate the topographic location of this mill. So that was an example of that. Back to Martinshaw Wood. In November 2013, following a presentation on the forthcoming Charnwood Roots project by Julie Attard to the Leicestershire Archaeological and Historical Society, the existence of a substantial resource of LiDAR data for the Charnwood area was discussed. We realised how LiDAR and its quality of recording elements of the historic landscape within wooded areas that had otherwise seen little survey was an ideal tool for mapping past features. It was also clear that large swathes of data for Charnwood were now freely available for research and analysis. And in March 2014, we got a project off the ground to analyse and report this data as part of the Charnwood Roots project. Nick Hannon, who did almost all the transcription of the LiDAR and did a fantastic job, was recruited to ULAS with a specific task of processing and analysing the LiDAR data available. The work was initially reported in the summer of 2014, in which validation of some of the newly found earthworks was possible due to a separate project that was running and just starting in Bradgate Park. So we did a lot of LiDAR in Bradgate Park. We managed to check some of that out at that stage. But much of the other stuff identified by Nick, we hadn't managed to validate. And of course, without the validation, it only has so much value. So the Charnwood Roots project looked at these LiDAR data sets. So the map's not that easy to interpret, but for those of you who know the area, this here is Bradgate Park. We're looking at Charnwood on the west side of Leicester. Here, Beacon Hill up here, Ratby Burrows here, and Martinshaw Wood tucked in there. We're going to have a very quick look at Warren Hill's Whittick, which is over here. So Whittick up here. From Google Earth, and then here is a little study area. And here is the LiDAR, the DEM, the colourful topographic map for our little area at Warren Hills, Whittick. And here is the boundary of the scheduled monument of the rabbit warrens. Now, the LiDAR data shows ever so nicely how, in fact, the rabbit warrens, and that's what these are, these kind of red and blue kind of things, they're actually they're not that easy to find on the ground, and the LiDAR actually gives you the brilliant ability of actually locating them very well. It also shows that these, and you can see these warrens over here as well, that they're actually in the fields to the south. And there was actually really quite a large warrening industry going on there at one stage, and the spread of activity is perhaps wider than we had thought it was. So that's what that comes from, medieval and post-medieval rabbit warrens, or pillow mounds, ditches each side, and then long banks down the middle, in which the rabbits burrow. A nice illustration of warrening going on. And that's that landscape. And there's actually there is a pillow mound in there, but you can barely see it. The LiDAR makes things look very clear, and if you try and photograph them, they don't show very well at all. And there's the landscape looking the other way out of over Colville and to the west. Some better preserved pillow mounds in North Yorkshire. So that was another little diversion, and now we are coming back to Martinshaw Wood to the west of Leicester. So 13 hectares and known as a woodland for at least 500 years. For those of you who don't know the area, those things will help to locate you. So the M1 running up to the northwest, Ratley to the south, Groby to the east, and the A50, old A50 on the north side. The old Quinto crane depot, for those of you who might know that on the old 50, is where I'm circling there. Those of you who know the M1 will know that once you've once you're on the M1 and heading towards the Colville exit, you actually go through a cut section of motorway, and up at the top of the cut on each side you've got dense woodland. That is Martinshaw Wood. The historic environment records, this is going to be from before we did our survey. There are a number of records there. We've got the later extent of Groby Park here in green. We've got a wood bank that's been identified there. We've got some crop marks. We've got an interesting scatter of Mesolithic flint up there just outside the woodland. Some other crop marks, possible features. This is an interesting feature. So we've got a possible Iron Age enclosure, Martinshaw Wood. Now, I'll speak about that a bit more further on in the talk. And we have some aerial photographs. So from post-war, when obviously there's been a lot of clearance of the woodland, a lot of woodland has come down. And you can see there are some forms in this photograph that are still there now. The predominant forms are the rides. So these big, long, wide tracks giving access into the woodland and carving it up into sections. And those rides have been there for a long time. This is the curious little feature that I mentioned, that's the possible Iron Age enclosure. And in fact, I think it was this photograph that Fred Hartley picked up this feature from in the perhaps the 1970s or early 80s. You can see a little bit of ridge and furrow down here to the south. Okay, there's a little detail of that bit. So Clearfeld, and a lot of planting then going to take place again because it's mostly planted now. So I thought I'd better have a quick check at the 2-inch map for Martinshaw Wood, because I hadn't done that, and putting this talk together earlier today, thought, well, I better have a quick look. So here is what you might see at the British Library, and it's the Leicester and Loughborough sheet, which has got Martinshaw Wood on it, dating from 1815. If you can get to the links that we put up later on, then you should be able to find this sheet. And there we go. There's a detail of Martinshaw, and quite clearly Martinshaw Wood, not Martinshaw Wood, here, and the rides in it. And this is from 1815. I've not spotted anything immediate on here that I need to draw to your attention. I don't think. It doesn't mean to say there's not stuff there. And here we go. So now the Ordnance Survey are into the swing of 6-inch maps and the 1 to 10,260 scale maps, and also 1 to 2,500 scale maps. And here is Martinshaw Wood in the late 1880s, and you can see the rides quite clearly. And you can also see a whole load of other paths, and there are a whole load of other paths. The lodge here on the east side. I'm just going to go through, do what's called the map regression, except we're going to go forwards. So there we go, 1904. That's what the Ordnance Survey have. Perhaps not quite as nice a quality of map. And then 1955, showing areas of planting that have come back again after that post-war clear felling. And then the 1960s, and the motorway has come, chopping through the woodland. The rides are still there, perhaps some slightly different paths formed. And the early 70s and the early 90s. So not a lot of change really. Obviously the motorway is one huge change, but within the woodland otherwise, we're seeing a managed woodland going through phases of use. Martinshaw Wood was listed in 1512 and possibly listed in the Domesday Survey, the late 11th century, but it's difficult to be categoric about which woodland they were referring to in the Domesday, there being several woods listed under the manor of Groby, so we can't be certain about that. Martinshaw was one of a series of woods managed by the Gray family. The antiquity of the woodland is hinted at by the richness and diversity of the flora and fauna in a study by Squires and Humphrey. And Martinshaw Wood lies within the area of the expanded Groby Deer Park until 1699, when it was disparked and the woodland remained. Woods and hunting parks often appear in association with each other in medieval landscapes. Woodland was an important part of the medieval English economy, providing underwood, coppice products and timber. Woods could also provide areas of grazing, and therefore woods were protected with the construction of boundary banks and ditches to control access. There's more evidence of woods becoming discrete areas in the 13th century within larger agricultural areas. And products from Martinshaw may well have included oak bark, perhaps with the demand from the Leicester tanneries, pannage, the grazing of pigs on the acorns in the autumn, and hardstone. There are some quarry holes in the woodland, so slate from the Toot Hills outcrop on the northern edge. Some documentary research has been undertaken, and the work by Tony Squires and P. Bloxham needs to be integrated with the results of the recent landscape study, and that hasn't been done. So I must say there's quite a lot of Martinshaw history of which I'm sorry I'm ignorant, but there's lots more to be found out if someone can put it together. Here's what I can tell you. This is the DEM. So this is the digital elevation model of the Lidar from Martinshaw Wood. Now, its height's giving us colours, and they're a bit garish, I know, but it kind of serves a purpose. High in the pink, so we've got an area of high ground up the top here, and very low is dark brown. So the land is falling as you're coming down this way. And then we've got some variations in that. We've got some little valleys and some lower points within that. I think what really strikes me about this image, actually, is if you look carefully, is what's going on in the middle there. And you've quite clearly got some form showing in the DEM data. And that is this little enclosure in the middle of the woodland. And we'll see a bit more of that in a bit. So I was saying DEMs don't always help, but in this instance, it actually shows really quite nicely. There's the one of the maps of the wood superimposed over the top to give you an idea of where you are. And there's the historic environment record features. So here's Martinshaw as a photo, and then if we actually look at our DTM, our filtered LiDAR, and trace it off, this is what we get. So the trees have been stripped away, and then from that, Nick Hannon was then able to transcribe features. So we can start with our little feature, our little enclosure in the middle here, really quite sharply formed. It's almost geometric in its shape, with a clear angle in the in the bank and ditch there, and bank and ditch there is. And then we have less clear features. We've got some long linear features here and here. We've got groups of linear features up here, also up here, and up here as well, and over here. Now, some of this I think actually relates to woodland planting, but some of it I think actually relates to earlier field systems. Remember, we've got some surviving field system, well, just about surviving. I think it's getting built on at the moment. The surviving bit of field system here, just on the approach to Martinshaw Wood on the edge. And there's more evidence of field systems around, and I mean, heavens above, field systems are very common from the medieval use of the landscape. And then, yes, other linear features that we don't quite understand. So they all need looking at to actually give us a chance of actually knowing what they were. So a project using Charnwood Roots volunteers to visit and verify the existence and character of the LiDAR features was devised. Hands up if you ever got lost in a wood. We actually had to have a technique to enable us to go and find the things that we wanted to find and allow people to locate themselves and know where they were and not get lost. So they had to be able to wander the woodland, find the possible LiDAR features in areas of dense trees and make records. Now, we visited some other archaeologists who are just starting a similar project in the New Forest in 2014-15, where teams of volunteers were being used to validate possible features using iPads. And this was me and Julie Attard in late 2014, I think. And we've gone to see a guy called Lawrence Shaw, and here we are on a bit of New Forest testing their iPads. So they had a method that they could use, and we essentially copied that same method and adapted it to what we had, but did a similar thing. And that involved exporting the LiDAR features from the Windows computers, where we digitize our stuff and create our features, onto mobile devices that you could take out into the woodland. And for those of you interested in the technical aspects of this, we needed to export what you call a shapefile or a feature class from the GIS into a KMZ format for the iPads or a GPX format for the Garmins. And at the same time, grid references were transformed from British National Grid to latitude and longitude. So we were kind of changing the coordinate system. Armed with an iPad or a Garmin, a researcher could go out into the landscape with a digital map of the features we were trying to find, with satellite signals automatically giving you your location. And this actually worked really well. So here's what we used. We got an iPad Air. We had a couple of those, and then I'm more of a Garmin person, so we use my Garmin eTrex 30. And here are our features, and here's the wood. So you can see it's actually areas of dense canopy that we've got to go into and try and find this stuff. There's one of the entrances to Martinshaw Wood, just on the edge of Ratby, and there is the bridge over the motorway. And some of you might recognise the view of the woodland from that might make sense to you now. So not easy to photograph, but here's a picture of an iPad with basically using Google Earth, which is where the tree canopy is coming from. And then we've got our locator turned on, which is this blue dot in the middle. And then we've got our LiDAR features. So these same features which Nick had transcribed from the LiDAR data. Now the LiDAR features have numbers. So we've got FL, feature LiDAR, and then 0042, feature LiDAR 287, I think, down there. And those, what we used those index numbers, and we created records. So here's one of our volunteers, Vivian Parker, with one of the iPads. And we made visits on 18 days between April 2015 and June 2016. 12 volunteers made visits on 18 days, 189 observations were made. We used proforma sheets designed to enable quick recording of essential information, with each observation also marked on a plan, on a paper plan. So techno lover that I am, I couldn't totally abandon paper, and we decided to actually keep some map sheets. As on A3, we took them out with us, and we actually annotated on those where we thought we'd been. So we didn't trust everything to the digital stuff. So here we can go. You can see you've got here's our little enclosure with its sharp break in the form there. Here we've got a ride. Here's the M1, and then we've got our features with the FL numbers. And here we've actually highlighted the feature we're going to try and find that day, feature LiDAR 286 there. And here's observation 1, and here is our record sheet. So we've got the date, the observation, who's made it, what their coordinate position is, what they think they found, a description of what they found, a sketched profile of what they found, and information on whether they've actually recorded any photographs. So, and this was the very basic record that we wanted in order to be able to understand what the LiDAR was saying, or at least give us a chance. So that's what we did for each observation. So 189 of those sheets with observations on them. Oh, in fact, there's observation 2 and 3. So what do we find? Put it all together. We found tracks and paths, perhaps as would be expected. So just as in the way that in the outwards at Nanpantan, I was finding that little tracks were actually giving us LiDAR signals. We found the same in Martinshaw Wood. So here we're actually walking along a track, and it's one of the LiDAR features that have been recorded. And there's another one. We found banks. Now these are difficult to photograph. Brian is actually standing on a bank, although I realise it doesn't look like he is. You're just going to have to believe me. And ditches, that's a bit more easy to understand. A clear ditch there, and then ditches that are another there, clearly woodland drains. So there we go, there's another ditch or a woodland drain. And there was Richard Graves who came to help us. And so multitudes of ditches and drains. And Dave's sitting in a woodland ditch too. Now these are just part of the woodland management. They're not really helping us understand the wood, but maybe when we put all the records together, some patterns might show. We also found fallen trees, again, as you might expect. So here's Sue and John Henderson and Richard Graves here. And we found other fallen trees in other areas that had given us anomalous signals as well. And we found some wide woodland boundaries, and here we got Stones. This is actually over on the far west side, southwest side of the wood, where you've actually got some really wide woodland boundary actually on the wood edge. And behind Anne, in this area, there is actually a raised up bank, and in which she's actually standing in a slightly lower area, and then there's raised up area in front of her again. So it's very difficult to photograph, but it's there in the LiDAR. And we've got areas where clearer banks, and here's Robin Matthewman, who came to help. He's standing on a bank, and there's another bank running towards it here, and there's actually a bank that runs in from the other side. We've got a union of banks, boundaries coming together, and this is just in the middle of the wood. So there clearly is stuff going on, but we just don't know what it means. And we've got old oak trees growing over banks. So here's John Henderson, he's standing on a bank, and there's an oak tree growing over the top of it, so clearly post-dating it. And we got some really quite deep banks. So Anne here is standing next to a bank that's getting on 2 meters high. And there we've got a similarly deep ditch as well. So there are really some quite large earthworks within the woodland. And there are quarry holes. And there are banks with rubble cores. Now, we'd have to give Sue Henderson all the credit for this, because she spotted this and started probing the areas of bank and actually finding that they've got a stone core. So you can clearly see here that you've got an area of rubble underneath the leaf mould. And we traced that into the woodland. Oh, that's just gone. There we go. And we found it crossing one of the rides. So this is one of the rides that actually runs northwest to southeast, going up the hill, out the west side of Martinshaw Wood. And you can actually see that there's actually a hard area here that's dry, and you've got a wet area that's boggy on that side. So I think there are actually some boundaries within the woodland that we're not seeing. And this is actually where it got chased into the wood, and there's actually a rubble core bank in this area here with a ranging rod sitting on it. I know it doesn't photograph. You're just going to have to trust me that it's there. Now, we also found vehicle tracks, and these are just a little bit of a nightmare actually, because there were loads of them. And in a wood, it seems that vehicle tracks get preserved. There's no plough to come and turn the land over. So once a vehicle has run through and rutted the ground up, the ruts stay there. So here we go. There's some vehicle tracks. There's some more vehicle tracks. Can you see here the tracks running away from us? There's some more tracks, and all these show as Lidar features. And then we found an axle. And that kind of goes with the vehicle tracks. And I had to try and find out what axle it was. So I pulled the axle out. And I think from the differential and the way the wheels are, they're kind of composite hubs, that it had to be from a Dodge M37 truck, something like that. So perhaps that had got used on a Dodge axle had been used on a woodland trailer. And we found other bits of machinery, a bit of perhaps a saw table. And that goes together with, I was talking about the areas of clear felling that were evident in the late 1940s. Now, the ridge and furrow, I think there are areas of ridge and furrow. This is from a photo I took in 2015, and it's washed out and you can't really see it, but there is where I thought I could see ridge, furrow and ridge. But I take it, it's not very good. There we go again. Ridge, furrow and ridge. So the ranging rod is sitting in the bottom of the furrow, and there's a ridge down that side and a ridge down that side. Now, I know when I've given this talk before that I can't really see your faces, but no one's particularly believed me. So I went back on Sunday and thought I'm going to go and re-find that ridge and furrow because I believe it. And here's a shot from Sunday in the same area. Now there is a ridge from the ridge and furrow running across in front of us, and then I hope that you can see that it's actually a furrow there, and then beyond it another ridge. So I'm absolutely convinced it's there. A custom database was written for the records by me, and the records were all scanned and then entered into that database. And the database included all the photographs with a visit number, and then everything was tied into a GIS so that we could see the results of our database on a map. And we could symbolize what we found. So the tracks and the wheel ruts and the banks and the ditches could be given images that might allow a pattern to come out. So here's a screenshot from the database. Down the left hand side we've got all our observations and their dates, and then in the middle we've got our Lidar feature numbers, and we've got what types of feature have been identified, so a bank and a ditch here, and we've got a photograph tied in there, We've got the coordinate information, the latitude and longitude, and also British National Grid. And so this data is then tied to the GIS. And this is what we start to come up with. So here's our legend. And perhaps most easily to knock them out, we've got the axle, that was over here. And then our wheel ruts are these big pinky symbols in here. So there's a bit of a cluster to those. We didn't really find them in the southern bit of the woodland. And then our banks and our ditches. So banks are an upward triangle, red triangle, and a ditch is a big black downward pointing triangle, and a gully is a smaller one. And then we've got some other things as well. We've got our possible ridge and furrow, and our rubble core bank, which I've got here as a wall up here, WW and W there. Okay, so there is a bit of a pattern coming together with that. What I then did was remove all the ditches and banks that were clearly woodland management related, and I also took out the tracks and the things that we weren't interested in as far as the historic development of the site goes, and that's what I came up with. So we'd kind of isolated some bank and ditch features, and I think this is where we can start to say something. So I think there is ridge and furrow agriculture here. Now that says to us basically, or fairly critically, that this area here was part of a medieval field system before it was a wood. Okay, so it's a totally different land use. So my argument is that we've actually got an early woodland here on the south side. And then the woodland is expanded to take in this area, which includes areas of ridge and furrow. There might be more ridge and furrow in this area here, but I couldn't really prove it in the LiDAR. And then I think there might be another expansion to take in this area here, and then another expansion after that to make the wood its current size. That's what my hypothetical argument is. Now, Julie Attard managed to get a copy of the 1757 estate map for the great estate map, including Martinshaw Wood. You can see here is Martinshaw Wood. So I took that and put it into the GIS, and here's a kind of screenshot of my GIS. So you can see maps in here. You can see a list of layers down the left-hand side, where we can turn layers on and off and make them visible and invisible. And yeah, that's where I put it. And then that enabled me to combine the map with the LiDAR features. So here we go. We've got a detail of the estate map with the LiDAR. Now you have to be careful when you do this, because if the estate map hasn't been produced with any accuracy, then things aren't going to be in the same place. But from what I could tell, it actually worked very well. So I think that estate map was pretty accurate, and it could be fitted to our regimented coordinate system pretty well. And the first thing to take in is you've got strip field systems recorded here on as part of the tithe. So all these strips, and they're allocated, they've got numbers, and they'll be allocated to people. And I think actually these strips continuing into this area is really quite a, isn't a huge leap of faith, given that I think we've got good evidence for ridge and furrow in this area here. There's a headland where groups of furlongs essentially come together. So you can see in the map, you've got a parcel of strips there and a line that runs down the middle, and then a change in angle, another parcel. So you've got a headland here, and I wonder if we're actually seeing that headland continue through in the LiDAR data, and it might possibly continue through there. Other information in this map, curiously, I've not got to grips with why there's an empty area shown on the estate map in our area where we've got this lovely little enclosure. So I can't give an answer to that. More research needs to be done. You know, I've done a half job. So that's kind of my headers. So the Banks and Ditch enclosure, and this is a photo from the spring of 2014, looking in towards the enclosure. So, and this, we've got a ditch in front of us and then a bank. It's a small feature as far as the area goes, but it's very well formed, and it really is quite pronounced. And this is how it all looks if you look at the LiDAR data in a 3D view, which you can also do with the programs that we use. So here, effectively, I've rendered the map onto the LiDAR data and also dropped the LiDAR data on the landscape. So you can then turn it round, and you can make more sense of the stream valleys. So here, in fact, we've got actually a kind of a stream valley here, and another one here. So perhaps changes in the field systems, you know, are quite likely to have actually happened on those topographic features anyway. In order to try and find more out about the little enclosure in the middle of the woodland, the Charnwood Roots commissioned a geophysical survey in March 2018. This was preceded by clearance of the scrub and the deadwood. And then in April 2018, we had magnetometer survey followed by ground penetrating radar carried out. And here is a geophysicist standing in the middle of the cleared enclosure. Now, the magnetometry was really disappointing and didn't give us any clear indications of archaeology at all. But the ground penetrating radar suggested there might be some features on the north side, but at a depth of 1 to 2 meters below the current ground level, and also suggested a possible buried ditch feature a ½ meter below the current ground level. So these would suggest, if they're true, that there are actually earlier features buried below the current formation. We don't know the date of this little enclosure. It could be Iron Age, but it could be medieval. It could be early post-medieval. And I think until something more is done to it, and perhaps some intrusive field work is done, we aren't going to know. The drains around the enclosure run freely, and it's really quite a wet area. And I haven't really spoken about how woodlands, you might often find them in areas that are otherwise marginal and aren't the best agricultural land. They can be poorly drained, good as woods, but not as areas of cultivation. And the drains around the little enclosure in Martinshaw Wood, they do run freely, but the inside of the enclosure remains dry at all times. So here's a little animation of Martinshaw Wood and the LiDAR features. So that's how we can take this dry bits of information, these figures, these ground heights, and then try and actually take them and try and make something of them to understand our past environment. So, to summarise, LiDAR is a powerful tool for identifying unrecognised historic features within the landscape and giving greater clarity to those already known. Features must be validated on the ground, as misidentification is all too easy. At Martinshaw Wood, as part of the Charnwood Roots project, volunteers have made this validation possible, and we are able to identify elements of the historic fabric and demonstrate a phased development of the woodland, which has included expansion of the woodland area. And the woodland appears to have been expanded perhaps in the early post-medieval period and has included an area of previous ploughland. with many thanks to Julie Attard and Nick Hannon, and to all the Charnwood Roots volunteers and everyone else and people who I might have forgotten.